Talking Points. My name is Dr. Stephen E. Gardner, and I'm here with you today to continue this series on Tell Me Something I Didn't Know about the Beatitudes. And in this segment, we're going to talk about something very positive for those who are the meek. And so today's topic is entitled, They Shall Inherit the What? Now, we're going to get into that, but before we get into what the meek shall inherit, let's look at what is mentioned already. Let's go back and let's look at some things that we've already talked about here. But let's start out with a quote. This quote says, "Those who live in a state of blessedness receive the best things in life." Those who live in a state of blessedness receive the best things in life. Let's review our series for a moment. This is what we've learned thus far. These are some of the things we've talked about here in this series. Point number one, those who are indwelt by God and fully satisfied by the same are really the blessed ones. Let that sink in. If God dwells in you and you're fully satisfied by the same, you are really the one that's blessed. Blessed is a state of being. It implies being fully satisfied by the one who dwells within. It does not mean if I do this or that, I will be blessed. Although some teach that you have to do a certain thing to get a certain blessing. However, the real blessing here is not the gift or the reward, but the state that you're living in. Because you reside in a state of blessedness, you can expect certain things to happen in your life. Jesus' message would not be good news if his teachings did not resonate with the expectations of the audience. Let me say that again. Jesus' message would not be good news if his teachings did not resonate with the expectations of his audience. And his audience was under Roman oppression, and they were expecting their Messiah to relieve them politically and militarily. Now let's go to Matthew 5:5. And in Matthew 5:5 it says, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." In this context, we find Jesus continually resonating with this audience. Those who are poor and those who mourn. We should have learned by now that they, that is the Israelites, the Hebrews at that time, were ostracized, oppressed, and were suffering injustice by the hands of Roman occupation. But not just them, even by the hands of their own leaders who were in bed with Rome. You should be learning by now that context is everything when it comes to interpreting Scripture, especially the words of Jesus. You should be learning that the common knee-jerk response by Christian leaders today is to spiritualize the text and make it fit the narrative of personal salvation or Christian ethics. And that's exactly what a lot of Christian leaders have done today when it comes to the Beatitudes. They consider this that's related to personal salvation or Christian ethics. This is not just some idiom or some wise saying that Jesus was saying to try to get them to elevate their life spiritually, which, yes, he wanted their life to be elevated spiritually, but he was speaking to the people who mourn. He was speaking to the people who are poor, and he's talking to those individuals that are meek. And we're going to find out who were the meek people. The Beatitudes was a huge reminder that Yahweh has not forgotten about the promises made to Israel. Let me say that again. The Beatitudes was a huge reminder that Yahweh has not forgotten about the promises made to Israel. And if Yahweh has not forgotten about the promises made to them, then we can expect the same for us today. Now, to go into a discussion that Jesus' message about personal salvation, but a collective deliverance of a people is a teaching we can delve into deeper on another day. However, the Beatitudes is a snapshot of what this specific group of oppressed people could expect from the hand of the divine. As Christ followers today, knowing what they expected gives us a healthy view of what to expect today. Again, we're talking about context. You know, it's easy to just open the Bible up and then wherever your finger fall and whatever God's speaking to you. And I'm not saying that God can't use that method. But if we want to understand what the writer meant, we want to understand what the speaker meant to the audience that they were confronting, we have to delve into the context. What in the world was Jesus talking about when he said the meek shall inherit the earth? What was he talking about? What was he preparing them for? He was resonating with their expectations already. Now, that is what the Beatitudes were about, is about resonating with that group of followers who fall into the category of the poor, those who mourn, and those who are meek. It's a snapshot of what this specific group of oppressed people, what they could expect from the hand of the divine. And obviously, if God did it for them, he'll do it for us. We have to understand what the context meant for them to really have a healthy view as to what to expect today. The text informs us that blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Again, just what in the world was Jesus talking about? Again, it's imperative that we look at this beatitude through their lens, the lens of these Galileans, the lens of these Israelites, these Hebrew people that were under Roman occupation. And trust me, scholars have made a heyday of conjecture of what Jesus was implying. I'm going to do the best that I can with the tools at my disposal and the help of the Spirit to paint the clearest picture of what Jesus is talking about here. However, let's begin with what scholars have to say. Here's one from C.S. Keener, and it's found in the IVP Bible Background Commentary of the New Testament, second edition. He makes this statement. In Matthew 5:5, Jesus cites Psalm 37, verse 9, and verse 11. Now, before we read the rest of his commentary, I'm going to quote to you Psalm 37, verse 9, and verse 11. And it says, "For the wicked shall be cut off, but those who wait for the Lord shall inherit the land." Verse 11, "But the meek shall inherit the land and delight themselves in abundant prosperity." Okay? So that is what verse Jesus is citing. When Jesus said, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth," he is pointing back to the Hebrew scriptures of Psalm 37, verse 9 and verse 11. Keener goes on to say, the meek are not those who try to bring the kingdom in politically or militarily, but those who humbly wait on God will inherit the earth. The Hebrew of the psalm could mean inherit the land. And in a narrow sense, you can look at Psalm 25, and let's switch over there real quick, 25 and 13. And 25 and 13 says, "They will abide in prosperity, and their children shall possess the land." So in this sense, the land or the earth, the land was probably, and the earth was probably implying and talking about the promised land, the land that God promised to the Israelites. So this is what's in their mind. This is what their context was. This is what their expectation. However, we find Roman occupations come in and have stolen from them, have taken their land. And we've seen some of those kind of, antics and operations today where people, colonizers, go in and take people's land and make them subject to them, and slave trade. And there's a lot of things that we can kind of relate to what we see here when we talk about the poor, the mourning, and the meek, as how that relates to the context that we're living in today. But we're not going to talk about that. But I wanted to just drop that in you to show you that humankind has not changed very much. And our God has not changed at all. And so what he done for them, he'll do for us. So the Hebrew of the psalm could mean inherit the land. And in a narrow sense, we've already read Psalm 25 and 13. But in Jesus' day, Jewish people expected God's people to reign over all the earth, as some other Old Testament passages suggest. Well, let's see what Bloomberg had to say in his commentary on Matthew. In Matthew 5:5, a meek person is not the wallflower we often think of when we use the word, but one who is humble, gentle, and not aggressive. Nevertheless, in the ancient Greco world, such humility was no more valued than in our world today. Inheriting the earth as future compensation suggests that the meekness in view also included a lack of earthly possessions. So he says the meek, humble, gentle, not aggressive. In fact, if we're students of the Old Testament, we know that the Bible refers to Moses being the meekest man. But does that mean he was a weak man? Meekness is not weakness. Can we say he was not aggressive? I think it's something more than that because we see how God used him as an instrument that did bring about some form of aggression to his oppressors. Some have said, and some scholars have said, that the idea of meekness in that context has to do with his ability to be teachable, his ability to rely upon the Lord to do the things that God would have him to do and not necessarily be maudlin or weak to the point to where people just run over you. I don't think Moses was a person that anybody could just run over. Because if you know the story, we find out Moses in the early stages, what did he do? He went off and killed somebody. And then he had to go become a fugitive. I think the idea of meekness has been watered down in our English vernacular. It is something that has to do with the style of people, especially in this context. It has to do with the kind of people that were oppressed, that were downtrodden, and that were ostracized. They were a category of people, not just those who were humble and gentle. Now, they were a people that lacked earthly possessions. Now, most people in Israel did not own their land and were subject to the whims of oppressive landlords. And you can read the book of James, chapter 5, verses 1 through 6, and you can see, the state that they constantly lived in while Rome was oppressing them. Do you think they want to hear about something about going about the sweet by and by? And, they wanted God to fulfill what his word says right here on this earth. They were the people that were resonating with the message of the Messiah, that finally the Messiah King has arrived to bring the land that's ours and restore it back to Israel. That's what they were looking for, and that's what the Beatitudes was echoing in their ear. But not only did it echo that, but it was also the echo of a future reward. And it generalized the promise of inheriting the land of Israel to include all the earth. Psalm 37, verse 11. And we know what it says there. And I'm going to quote it again. Psalm 37, 11 says, "But the meek shall inherit the earth and delight themselves in abundant prosperity." Let's go on a little bit further. Lang and Schaff, in their commentary on the Holy Scriptures of Matthew, says this. They say that verse 5 correlates with the meek of 37:11. The meek shall inherit the land and delight themselves in abundant prosperity. In this beatitude, the promise of the Holy Land, the enemies being driven out, is a symbol of the kingdom of heaven. Still, outward possession, and that in all its fullness, is also referred to in the expression the land or the earth. So the enemies being thrown out, them coming out from under Roman oppression, them no longer having to submit to the dictates and the edicts of Caesar and those who were in bed with them. That type of expulsion is a symbol in their mind of the kingdom of heaven. Powell, in the HarperCollins Dictionary, makes this particular statement about verse 5. He says, the meek, a quality with different meaning in Jewish and Greek context. Now, this is really getting to the point. In the Hebrew tradition, the meek and Awim are virtually synonymous with the oppressed. In the Hebrew tradition, The meek, anawim, are virtually synonymous with the oppressed. The term is generally descriptive of a social condition. Did you hear that? In the Hebrew tradition, the meek are a description of a social condition, a lack of power rather than a virtue. And how we're taught today, the meek shall inherit the earth, we're taught it in the context of a virtue and not a description of a social condition. In Greco-Roman literature, however, meekness is comparable to humility and is often listed as a virtue of slaves and others who do not try to rise above their station. Most references to meek in the Hebrew Bible should be understood in the former sense. What's the former sense? It's a descriptive of a social condition, lack of power, rather than a virtue. In Isaiah 11:4, and let's switch over there real quick. Isaiah 11:4, it says this: "But the righteousness he shall judge the poor and decide with equity for the meek of the earth. He shall strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he shall kill the wicked." So here, the meek are equated with the poor. And in Psalm 29:19, let's see what it has to say there. And Psalm 29:19 says this: "The meek shall obtain joy in the Lord, and the neediest people shall exult in the Holy One of Israel." So, let me repeat this thing that you see on the slide here. In Isaiah 11:4, the meek are equated with the poor. And Isaiah 29:19 says they are equated with the neediest people of the earth. The meek is a descriptive of a social condition, those who lack in power rather than a virtue, not those who fall into the category as compared to those who are the virtue of slaves that do not try to rise above their station. There's a lot that could be said about that, but this is not the place or the time for it. We'll talk about that maybe some other time. So thus, Powell goes on to make this point. The promise in Psalm 37:11, "The meek shall inherit the earth," should read as a reversal of social conditions rather than a reward for an appealing attitude. Oh no. Did you hear that? It should be read as a reversal of social conditions rather than a reward for an appealing attitude. When God's will is done, the meek, that is, the oppressed of the earth, will get what they had been coming to them all along, which is an inheritance, not a reward. It's an inheritance, not a reward. Blessed are the meek, for they shall what? Inherit the earth. That's not a reward. They're getting what's coming to them that was promised to them all along. They'll receive their share of the promised land, which they had been unjustly deprived. Boy, that gives us some hope today of those who have been deprived of their land, deprived of what God has said. Look, God is always working on our behalf to try to get to us that which he has promised us, to intervene in our affairs so that we can be assured that he is the Lord of Lords and the King of Kings. So, the poor, the mourners, and the meek, the first, second, and third beatitude, they're all the same class of people. Well, why does this text matter? Remember, Jesus in the Beatitude was appealing to their expectation. They were looking for social and political deliverance. Their salvation included their land being returned to them. Jesus, their Messiah King, has showed up, died, rose from the dead, and proved he was who he said he was by many convincing proofs after his resurrection. Their question after teaching about the kingdom for 40 days post-resurrection was this, and you can find this in the book of Acts, chapter 1. After Jesus did all this teaching about the kingdom, after he had rose from the dead, before he ascended into heaven, they asked this question: will you at this time restore the kingdom to Israel? Is this the time that the meek will inherit the earth? Do you see how this stuff connects the meek, the mourners, and the poor as being those downtrodden in the earth, as being this group of people, who were expecting the Messiah King to bring them deliverance? And when Jesus shows up, their hope has now elevated to the point to where God's going to keep his word. So their question was not a question of ignorance or spiritual or lack of spiritual insight. It was simply, are you going to restore the kingdom to Israel? Is this the time that the meek will inherit the earth? They were expecting the Hebrew prophets, or rather, they were expecting what the Hebrew prophets and other Old Testament passages spoke about. They were the poor, they were the mourners, they were the weak. Well, how does this relate to us? This beatitude is a reminder that Yahweh will keep his word to those who are faithful to his covenant. And if we have kept his word, if he kept his word for Israel, he will keep his word for the church, the Christ follower. This beatitude is a reminder that Yahweh cares more about our lives and our circumstances than just to rapture us out of here. There's something that he wants to do down here on this earth for those who are faithful. We can expect that. The first beatitude was a promise of the kingdom of heaven. And now this third beatitude is a promise of inheriting the earth. We have a lot to look forward to both now and in the future. Well, I trust you've been blessed by this lesson. Hopefully it gives some insight as the value of delving into the context. Obviously, the Beatitudes are taught different ways by different teachers today, and many of them talk about it being a virtue, and this is something that you're going to get in the afterlife. But that is not the context that Jesus and his disciples were in at the time. They were looking for a Messiah to bring about deliverance. They were the meek of the earth. They were the poor in spirit. They were those who mourn. Continue to follow us on the rest of this series, and hopefully we can gain some deeper insight into the context and tell me something I didn't know about the Beatitudes. God bless you. We'll see you the next time.